I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about the topic of infantry in battle. This is a subject that I have been very passionate about since I was a child. I was homeschooled over in Indiana as my background, and as a young child read through Genevieve Forster's George Washington's World, and there are passages in that book, of course, about figures from all across the 18th century that I was just enraptured by. But while I loved hearing about George Washington and General Braddock and other figures from the North American 18th century world, where I really just couldn't put it down was the fighting over in Europe. As David mentioned, I'm a scholar primarily of the Prussian army in the 18th century. And so trying to turn that interest into a career, I'm pleased to say that after spending what seems to my wife like a lifetime getting my PhD, I was able to do that. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about this research this morning that has turned into my first book.
The Prussians can't cross a ditch without a compass and chain.
We'll see a bit about that this morning, sir. All right. So advancing to the next slide here, I think there's a perception among members of the public in North America and even over in Europe that 18th century warfare is very rigid, it's very formal, and it's about things like controlling the soldiers, controlling the formations, engaging in things like platoon fire. There's a sort of scholarly debate or even a debate in the public to what extent we can characterize 18th century wars as lace wars. That is to say, how seriously can we take a time in military history where the soldiers are wearing sort of fancy lace and powdered wigs? And of course, hopefully we know they're not actually wearing powdered wigs. Most of these men are wearing their own hair long and putting hair powder in it. But still, I think there's this perception, man, let's run through the 18th century wars and get to a serious war like the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War. I was at a conference at the Marine Corps University in April, and I presented my talk, and then the organizer of the conference said, "Whew, thank goodness, we're about to get into the Napoleonic Wars, a real war that we can talk about." So let's characterize these wars this morning and try to understand what it was like for the enlisted men who took part. What was warfare in the 18th century like for these soldiers? And a lot of the ideas that historians come up with, I think, are only as good as the scholars they're in touch with. I've been very blessed in my career to have had some incredible mentors and met incredible historians like Dr. Preston along the way. Primarily, though, I have been influenced by the gentleman you see over there on the lower right of the slide, Dr. Christopher Duffy. Sadly, he passed a few years ago, but for many years, Christopher was one of the leading historians in the 18th century, focusing on subjects like the Prussian and Austrian armies, the Russian army, and even like the Jacobites over in Europe. Now, in more recent years, particularly focusing on the British army, a lot of Christopher's ideas have been embraced by scholars like Stephen Bromwell and Matthew Spring, also by a new generation of historians that I kind of put myself in, working on common soldiers and their experiences over in military Europe, like Sasha and Katrin Mubius and Ilya Berkovich. Matt, can you come help me, please? The question that I think we need to turn to today is what... There we are. Okay. We'll go here. What's the popular perception of warfare in 18th century memory as people watch films and think about what combat was like? I think you see some themes. First of all, the idea is these soldiers are moving slowly. They're moving sometimes to the beating of drums, sort of the cadence, the adoption of cadence step by the Alta Dessau, the Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau over in Europe is usually viewed as a benchmark of the development of 18th century warfare. The idea is you see repeatedly from both the public at reenactments and from 18th century historians like David Atkinson that musket fire occurs at very close range, perhaps 50 yards. You might hit something at 50 yards, you're hopeless beyond 100 yards. The soldiers are really always waiting reactively for their officers' words of command, trying to respond so the officers can direct the battalion. George Washington even writes in the course of the American Revolutionary War, a perfect army functions like clockwork, almost like a machine. And reading statements like this from Washington, modern historians and reenactors often focus on the discipline and the rigidity that we seem to find in 18th century warfare. Well, whether it's movies maybe that you all have been tortured with, like Mel Gibson's The Patriot or The Sovereign Servant, which is over here on the slide, there's the idea that you have trading volleys, that you come in to close range, marching slowly, and the enemy fires, and then you fire, and you sort of reload and sort of take turns volleying back and forth. The men don't take cover, they just kind of stand there getting blasted. They're waiting to get shot by the enemies, slowly kind of working their muskets, preparing to fire again themselves. Maybe after a couple exchanges of volleys, there's a quick charge into melee combat. The idea that, even statements from Suvorov, one of the great Russian generals of the 18th century, musketry isn't that important, really it's all about the bayonet. The bayonet is really what decides 18th century warfare. You see this in film, as the guys are sort of mixing it up in melee combat with great frequency, in not just, of course, here on the screen, but also films like The Patriot. And really, melee combat is what matters as far as winning these 18th century battles. Today I want to try and walk you through a slightly different model of 18th century warfare, one that I have developed as a result of archival research here in the United States, up in Canada, and over in several countries in Europe. And so I want to emphasize that 18th century common soldiers, they think about whether or not to obey their officers. They think about whether the commands from their officers actually make sense in the environment of the battlefield. They certainly aim their muskets at the enemy. They fight as skirmishers, something that we normally associate with the development of Napoleonic warfare. Well, the Hessians in the American Revolution, there's even armies in the Seven Years' War, like the Hanoverian army and the French army, they're all using skirmishers in a way that we would associate with the Napoleonic battlefield. Even as far back as I start my book, you see in the 1730s, in the War of Polish Succession, grenadiers act as skirmishers in these battles in northern Italy, in the War of Polish Succession. Frequently, they fire without waiting for words of command. Officers are incredibly annoyed by this. They think that the men are, George Washington writes repeatedly, the men are throwing away their fire at long shots. They're not waiting to fire at 50 yards, probably where the musketry is more effective. Instead, they're firing at a much longer distance. The men also usually aren't marching to the beating of drums. If they're marching slowly, they have the cadence internalized. The drums aren't calling the cadence. But perhaps more importantly, they're running on the battlefield. They're running in and out of the lines of fire. They take cover when they're being shot at. They don't just stand there like robots waiting for the enemy's volley to wipe them out. If they see the enemy getting ready to fire, hopefully they'll be behind some sort of solid cover. If not, maybe they're throwing themselves to the ground. And last but not least, they prefer to stay at a longer range and avoid melee combat. They use the threat of the bayonet, but they don't relish the idea of getting into close range and attacking the enemy at these close ranges. And so I want to summarize a quote for you here, because it's in the notes and I can't see that on this version of PowerPoint, from the Battle of Guastalla in 1734. And at this battle, a Irish soldier who's fighting in the Austrian army describes the nature of combat at Guastalla in 1734. He says, we marched slowly, sort of making a good front, until we got about 150 yards away from the enemy position. And then one grenadier ripped his musket away from his shoulder and began to fire without orders, and all the other grenadiers followed his example. And so the officers come in, they're hitting the men with the flats of their swords, trying to get them to stop firing. The men don't listen to these commands, and they continue to sort of plopped there about 150 yards away from the enemy, firing back and forth all day. Irishman Johann Sigismund Maguire von Inniskillen is an Irishman in the Austrian army. He writes at the end of his diary entry that day, if they had just closed with the bayonet, our general would have been like a second Charles XII of Sweden. Instead, their fire was a little service. We killed few of the enemy, they killed few of us, we ran out of ammunition, we had to withdraw. It's a battle that was a little bit differently than most of our preconceptions of 18th century warfare. The Prussian army is thought of as a very rigid military organization, one that emphasized speed of fire rather than accuracy of fire. But if you actually take time and read the Prussian infantry regulations of 1750, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, the king of Prussia, the sort of leader of military thought for much of the mid-18th century, he sort of makes careful notations. We've got to get the men to aim. We have to ensure that they level well. Take a good aim without hurry. The men must look boldly into their fire. Sometimes, I'm a reenactor, a situation that I've never fully financially recovered from. But sometimes if you look at pictures at reenactments, I have a good buddy named Paul, who's at a reenactment, and he constantly fires like this. This is what Frederick is trying to avoid in an 18th century context. The men have to look boldly into their fire. This is what they do in order to take a good aim. And if you go to the World Ablaze Gallery, maybe before the lunch hour here, you'll see that a lot of these muskets in the 18th century, they have front sights. Some of them, like the Swedish musket here in the gallery, have back sights as well. So the men, they are aiming these muskets, or at least trying to aim these smoothbore weapons to the best of their ability. In the Revolutionary War, a German soldier, sometimes we'd call him a Hessian, really he's from Braunschweig, the small state of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, Freiherr Riedesel, he says, man, General Carleton, the governor of Canada, he's organizing our soldiers and having them all train sort of to do marksmanship, doing what the English in the 18th century call firing at marks. And so there, you can see kind of the outline for it here, the full quote, I don't reproduce. There are cash prizes for the best shot in each company, and these aren't Jaegers armed with rifles. These are ordinary soldiers in line or hacked battalions, depending on what you want to call them, firing smoothbore muskets. They're being trained to aim their weapons here in this Revolutionary War. As far as not waiting for the officers to sort of give words of command, you have a lot of evidence that what we might call firing at will or independent fire, or the 18th century German armies of various stripes, the Austrians and the Prussians, call Klackerfeuer, happens endemically throughout 18th century armies all across. Yeah, that's absolutely right, sir. That's what the French call it. And you know what the Marquis de Guibert says about this? He says it's the best of all fires. That this fire is more effective than any other sort of fire. That's a particular French interpretation. These other armies, they're a bit more embarrassed about this. This German source from late in the 18th century says, man, this is highly embarrassing, as after 100 years of practice, we cannot bring common soldiers under control and build an unfeeling shooting machine. So again, this idea that 18th century soldiers are robotic. The officers are saying, man, we can't build an unfeeling shooting machine, which I think is a strong comment here from Johann Gottfried Hoyer. Well, the English, I mean, if there's an army famed for kind of rigidity of discipline and speed of fire, it's the Prussians. If there's an army that's, I think we popularly as reenactors or war gamers think about the English genius when it comes to war, we think about platoon fire. We think about the way that the English organize their platoons and battalions in order to deliver a rolling fire at the enemy, always maintaining a reserve of loaded muskets. You can see a diagram of this here. The question is, do they actually do this in practice? You have a comment here from the disaster at Prestonpans during the 1745 Jacobite emergency. Comment from an officer who was there saying, "I shall only add, the fire of our foot was infamous. Puff, puff." It's like he's on like a mechanic trying to diagnose the sound of the car problem. He's describing the fire, the placard fire. No platoon that I heard, although I have heard others say who were in the action, they heard maybe 2 platoons that they were able to fire like this, the way they were supposed to do. So maybe it happens. Right before the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745, a brigadier general is riding behind the lines, and a battalion commander comes up to him and says, "Well, sir, how should we engage the enemy tactically? Should we fire by ranks? Should we fire by platoons?" And the brigadier general responds, "As to platoon or rank firing, I should be glad to see you perform either. But I own that I never did yet on a field day or at a review. So this is something we do in practice on the drill square. It's not something this British brigadier general has ever seen performed in action." Of course, there are many quotes like this. Kind of description of sort of Hyde Park firing. General Stair is talking about here. It's probably one of the most famous, and lots have been made of this. David Blackmore, a wonderful historian working on British firepower over in Britain, says, can we really trust this quote? These officers who are having this conversation are a mile away from fighting. I think when you combine it with the other weight of evidence that we see from the British Army in the War of Austrian Succession, there's maybe something to this. There is. If Lord Stair is saying he had seen many a battle and never seen the infantry engage in any other manner, I think that's a pretty telling piece of evidence, sort of combined with these other citations. See this continue into the American War of Independence, where Thomas Anbury says, "Man, what is actual combat like? Well, in this action, I found that all manual exercise is but an ornament. So we don't actually use it very much in combat. The only object of importance it can boast was that of loading, firing, and charging with bayonets. And as far as the actual method that we're doing this, we're not following through all of the words of command, we're tap loading. That is to say, we're striking our musket butts on the ground as opposed to sort of ramming home with the ramrod. It's something you see descriptions of it from English sources. We have sources of continental Europe saying the Austrians are doing this like at the Battle of Molwitz in 1741. The soldiers loading as fast as they possibly can in the heat of the moment, in that need to fire maybe psychologically at the enemy, placard fire. Now, this is the Battle of Parma Battle of Parma. This is from a painting at the Royal Court in Torino, or Turin. You see a lot of cover on these 18th century battlefields. If you read period descriptions of battles that maybe we don't think about a lot because there aren't red-coated British soldiers there, but battles where 50,000 men are on each side, like Parma and Guastalla in the War of Polish Succession, where I begin my book, there's a lot of micro-tactical terrain. Ditches and hedges and sort of rows of trees and small groups of stone houses or casina. And the men are taking cover in these buildings. They're firing at the enemy from the windows of the casino, from behind the hedge. There are descriptions of the sort of grenadiers who are advanced as skirmishers at the Battle of Parma, who are behind a hedge and they're sort of taking cover while the enemy is firing at them. And then small groups of them run out to fire at the enemy from beyond the hedge after the enemy has fired their volley. So there is absolutely, I think, a world in which the men are alternatively firing and taking cover here. You see it all throughout 18th century armies, descriptions of this practice of the men taking cover. Guibert, who I've already mentioned here, he says, man, we shouldn't allow the front rank to kneel when we're firing in 3 or 4 ranks, because when they do, they don't want to stand back up and they just crawl on their bellies and sort of fire from a prone position for the rest of the battle. It's a dangerous practice. In the British case, you have descriptions from the battles of the War of Austrian Succession where the men will see the enemy making ready to fire and then throw themselves to the ground. These are matched well from descriptions like the Battle of White Plains in the American War of Independence, where the Redcoats aren't just waiting to kind of get picked off by Mel Gibson. They're doing this exact same thing, they're throwing themselves to the ground when they see the Continental Battalion presenting in order to give fire. Samson Staniforth, one of my, I think, favorite soldier memoirists from the 18th century, he describes the process of being shot at by an enemy battery of heavy artillery. That there's an enemy battery defending this village. The men are sort of marching up. We see the cannons being ready to fire. And as a result, not just the men doing it involuntarily, but the officers saying, man, lie down. We're about to be sort of shot hit with canister. And so as a result, the men do. Some are still killed, even though they take cover in this way. They sort of drop to a prone position. After this fire is passed over their heads, they stand back up and they continue the advance. It's a more flexible world than we might first imagine. Corporal Todd, another great mid-18th century British diarist describing descents on the French coast in the 1750s, says, we're attacking out of sort of boats and longboats on the French coast. Here the men are lying down, not to avoid incoming French fire, but so that the warships that are supporting the advance can safely fire artillery over the heads of their own men. So again, you take cover, or you take a prone position in the 18th century, not just to facilitate survival from incoming fire, but to facilitate supporting or outgoing artillery fire as well. Finally, in the War of Independence, you see here comments that might seem more like you're in the Overland Campaign of the American Civil War, that the soldiers aren't just taking fire, but they're taking cover from enemy fire, but they're also gathering brushwood. They're almost like digging in the face of the enemy advance. Why? To prevent us from being seen as marks. Again, when you talk about target practice in the 18th century, if in English language context, you call it firing at marks. They want to try and avoid becoming a target, so they're piling up brushwood in front of their position. Now, as far as running on the battlefield, we have comments from the War of Polish Succession, from the 7 Years' War. There are many descriptions from the Battle of Prague, Prussian Fusilier Regiment, and you can see a Fusilier cap in the World of Blaze Gallery. They say, men, in the line of advance, sort of to keep the line of battle contiguous, we had to pass through a series of ponds next to the village of Arnhem. And so, while the other Red battalions on sort of the right and left flank, they continued marching, we had to kind of break the battalion and run through the dry parts of these ponds in order to reform the battle line. So there's not a gap in the battle line, almost like Chickamauga for my Civil War buffs in the audience. So this is something that when the situation requires, when there's an emergency, the men don't just stand there saying, man, there's a watery ditch, what are we going to do? They run the battalion through wherever they can in order to reform the battle line. You see comments from the War of Polish Succession where French battalions know that the line of battle, sort of on the other side of the battlefield, is under attack. They're ordered to go and reinforce that part of the battlefield. And we have comments from French veterans who say, in order to reach the embattled portion of the line, we ran almost as in a race. So these guys are not, sort of waiting for the drums to call cadence. They're trying to get there as rapidly as possible, reform the battalion, and go into action. You have comments from Prussian and Hessian soldiers all across the 18th century world, where the officers almost sheepishly note, "We ran to meet the enemy. The battalion was not in perfect order." So there are a variety of situations where, not just at this attack at Leuthen here on the churchyard, you see the men engaged in pretty quickly or in surprising ways. Now, this leads us, I think, to what in 2008 Matt Spring argued about the British Army in the American War of Independence. Those of you who've not read his incredible book on the British Army, With Zeal and with Bayonets Only, I highly recommend it to you. The British Army in the War of Independence is fighting in open order in two ranks. They're moving at a pretty quick speed, at a quick march, or almost a jog when they get within musket range. They're basically, once they get within 300 yards, moving at what we might think of as close to a run, they might fire one volley and then try to drive the rebels off with bayonets. This is how trying to maybe avoid extended firefights that can produce casualties that will create more of a logistical strain on the British Empire. And so as a result, a lot of initiative, not just on the part of ordinary soldiers, but on the part of junior officers, is extremely necessary for the British Army in the American War. And there are a lot of comments from maybe soldiers who aren't quite as familiar with this, like Baron Rita Zell, who we met earlier, say, man, how are the British fighting in unique ways over in North America? Well, here, describing an action at the end of the Canadian campaign, 1776, our forces are starting to withdraw from Canada. So the brigadier went to meet them on the road to Montreal and came across their column. He halted and gave orders for one of the English regiments to lie down, and in this position send one well-placed volley after another at the enemy, whilst unseen themselves. This was all the more successful as it was in a dense forest where they met the rebel column. The enemy took flight in the utmost confusion at this unexpected firing and hastened back to the water. I always tell my students, here it's the British are Mel Gibson, and we're the guys getting picked off, right? So it's sort of an interesting world for us to put ourselves in. But Rita Zell in this passage goes on to explain why the British do this. And this, I promise, is going to get us back to General Braddock and the fighting in the 7 Years' War. But the English make it one of their chief rules and principles in this country that no maneuvers may ever be carried out in serried ranks in these districts that are so terribly wooded. They found that out to their cost in the last war against the French in North America, which they were always unsuccessful at the commencement, until they had taught their men to maneuver with open ranks and covered themselves by means of trees, after which they were always successful. So really, it's the 7 Years' War, it's the French and Indian War that is teaching the British to fight like this. It's the experience of what happens at the Monongahela that is still present in the British Army. It's encouraging them to fight like this. And in preparation for this talk, I was sort of drinking coffee this week thinking, why don't the British just do this naturally? If other European armies are taking cover and running on the battlefield, why do the British at Monongahela, why do they struggle to fight in this way? And going back to the work of my mentor, Christopher Duffy, he makes an argument that soldiers at the beginning of a war, particularly new recruits, sometimes have difficulty conceiving of combat outside of what they've seen on the drill square. So the Prussians at Mollwitz, they are approaching the Austrian position, and they stop and they begin platoon fire. They begin platoon fire at what seems to us in the modern world is almost like a ridiculous distance of like 800 yards. It's not a very rational decision, but they're doing the best they can. They've been a peacetime army for like 25 years. They're trying to match what they know of war from the drill square to the reality of combat. I think maybe some of that is happening with General Braddock. As far as why the French, maybe they're fighting in different ways. We could attribute this to a better relationship with Native Americans, so kind of maybe a lazy level, but I think if you read what Montcalm has to say about the war in America, he doesn't say things like, oh golly, there are a lot of trees over here. I mean, it's not like it is over in Europe. After the Battle at Carillon in 1758, if you read Montcalm's after-action report from that battle, how does he describe it? He says the infantry firefight on the one side and the other was just like that at the Battle of Parma. And so he's drawing on the experiences that the soldiers in the War of Polish Succession had, staying behind sort of raised dikes and hedges and taking cover and sort of firing it more as skirmishers and this sort of rolling fire that the Comte de Guibert calls the best of all fires. He's using the European experiences of the French army in order to fight a more flexible and adaptable war to great effect here in North America. Thank you so much for your time this morning.